It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight filtered through the windows just right, casting a golden glow across the room. I was getting ready for what should have been a relaxing family gathering. But then, she walked in, with him. Her cool new friend. I could feel the tension in the air the second they entered. My wife, Julia, had been talking about this guy for weeks, how much fun he was, how effortlessly cool, how he fit in with her world so seamlessly. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we had both made new friends over the years, and I had always supported her socializing. But this time, something felt different. Something was off. They walked into the living room, and I couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. The confident swagger, the casual smile that was almost too practiced. His eyes scanned the room like he owned the place, and when he made eye contact with me, I could feel a strange sense of competition. It was subtle at first, but I wasn't blind. "Babe, this is Kyle," Julia introduced, her voice filled with that tone of admiration I couldn't ignore. "Kyle, this is my husband, Mark." I offered a polite smile and extended my hand, trying to keep the peace. But the handshake was firm, too firm. It was almost like he was testing me. His grip lingered for a second longer than necessary, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but it felt like he was challenging me in some silent, almost playful way. "Nice to meet you," he said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Julia's told me a lot about you." "Good things, of course." I glanced at Julia, unsure whether she realized the strange energy between us. She was beaming, practically glowing with excitement at the prospect of her new friend joining our family gathering. But I wasn't so sure. Something about Kyle felt off. I led them to the living room where the rest of the family was gathered, settling them on the couch. The conversation started normally enough, small talk about work, the weather, and the latest family gossip. But the moment Kyle opened his mouth, I could feel the shift in the air. He wasn't just participating in the conversation, he was dominating it. His stories were all about adventure, about how he traveled the world, how he was always on the cutting edge of trends. He spoke about his job with a self-assuredness that made me wonder if he was lying half the time. And, of course, Julia hung on every word, laughing at all the right times, nodding in agreement, as if he had just discovered the secret to life itself. But what irritated me the most was the way he kept trying to one-up me. When I spoke about my own job, about the things I had accomplished, he'd casually dismiss it with some "yeah, that's cool. But have you ever tried?" And then he would go off on some tangent about the most random, obscure experiences he'd had, each one somehow managing to sound more impressive than the last. The more Kyle talked, the more I felt like a ghost in my own home. My family was enjoying his company, laughing at his jokes, listening intently to his stories, while I was left sitting there, an outsider in my own living room. Julia kept looking at me with that proud smile of hers, and I knew exactly what she was thinking. I found someone who really gets me. But the worst part was that she couldn't see it. She couldn't see what I was seeing. How Kyle was subtly manipulating the situation. How he was slowly making me feel insignificant, like my role in this family gathering wasn't important anymore. At first, I told myself to relax. After all, it was just one afternoon, right? Just a few stories and a couple of drinks. But as the afternoon wore on, I could feel my patience wearing thin. The more Kyle spoke, the more he revealed his true nature. At one point, he casually mentioned something about how Julia had changed since meeting him. The words were light, almost as if he were complimenting her. But there was a sharpness in his voice that I didn't miss. "She's way more fun now," Kyle said with a laugh. "You know, when we first met, she was a little uptight. But since I came into the picture, she's loosened up. It's been great, honestly." I could feel my blood pressure rising. I tried to keep my cool, but his words lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. The way he made it sound, it was almost like he was taking credit for my wife's personality transformation. Like I hadn't been the one to support her, to be there for her through thick and thin. My hands tightened into fists, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't, at least, not yet. Julia was still too enamored with him, too happy to have him around, to even notice the discomfort creeping into my voice. But what really set me off was when he casually threw in a line about how he and Julia had been through a lot together. The insinuation was clear: they had a bond that I didn't understand, one that was stronger than anything I could offer. That was it. I couldn't sit there any longer, pretending that everything was fine. I had to do something. The moment Kyle finished one of his over-the-top stories about his crazy adventures, I stood up. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, but I wasn't going to back down. Julia looked at me with a quizzical expression, probably wondering why I was suddenly so quiet. But I was done being passive. "Kyle," I said, my voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. "You've told us about your travels, your life, your experiences. But I think it's time you told us about something else. Something a little more relevant to this conversation." Kyle raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, his smirk fading just a little. "Well, I've been hearing a lot about your so-called adventures," I said, my voice steady. "But I think it's time you tell us about the last time you were in town. The one where you tried to." And that's when it happened. That's when I dropped the bombshell. The room fell silent. The air grew heavy with uncertainty. Julia's eyes flickered between me and Kyle, confusion playing on her face. Kyle, on the other hand, looked like he had just been caught in a lie he never thought would come to light. His confident facade cracked for just a moment, his smirk faltering before he could mask it with that all-too-familiar coolness. What do you mean?" Kyle stammered, the calmness in his voice now replaced with a slight edge of discomfort. It was the first time I'd seen any sign of unease from him. I could feel the eyes of my family members on us, the tension building, as if they could sense something was about to explode. Julia, still completely unaware of the storm brewing in front of her, stared at me with a puzzled expression, her lips parting as if to ask a question but unsure if she should. "Kyle," I continued, not letting him off the hook, "I'm talking about the time you came into town a few months ago, the time you forgot to mention when you were telling us all about your adventures. You know, the one where you were a little too chummy with someone who's part of the family. How you had that fun weekend with Jessica, my cousin." The name dropped like a stone into a calm pond. The ripples were instant, spreading out in all directions. For a brief moment, there was silence. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world had stopped, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Kyle's face turned a shade paler. His confident, almost smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by something much less convincing: fear. Julia's expression shifted from confusion to shock, her eyes wide as she looked between me and Kyle. What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaky as if she was already beginning to piece together the ugly truth. Kyle tried to recover quickly, but it was obvious that I had caught him off guard. He cleared his throat, attempting to sound casual, even though his posture had become rigid. "Look, Mark," he said with forced ease, "it's not what you think. Jessica and I, we just hung out, that's all. There's nothing to it." I saw the lie in his eyes, and I knew exactly where he was going with it. He was trying to deflect, trying to minimize everything, hoping Julia wouldn't dig deeper. But Julia wasn't stupid. She had always been sharp, and this was different. This wasn't just some hanging out story. She could feel it. "Jessica?" Julia echoed, her voice rising. "Kyle, you never mentioned her. Why didn't you tell me you were with her? She's family, for God's sake." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, his cool exterior slipping further. I could practically see the calculations running through his mind, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to keep up the illusion that he was the charming, charismatic guy everyone adored. But it was too late. The cracks had already formed, and the truth was beginning to leak through. "Julia, I swear," he said, his voice now sounding more defensive. It wasn't like that. We just had a few drinks, talked about the old times, that's it. Nothing happened, okay? Julia's face was now a mixture of disbelief and confusion, her lips parted as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. But you've been seeing her, all this time? Kyle hesitated, clearly caught in his own lie. The silence stretched on for a few agonizing seconds before he spoke again, but his voice was much softer, much more strained. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Julia. I didn't want you to find out like this. That was it, the confession I had been waiting for. Kyle's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The cool guy who had walked into my home with all the charm in the world was now exposed. The cracks in his facade were clear, and he knew it. He could no longer play the part of the untouchable, smooth-talking friend who had the ability to manipulate anyone he wanted. I turned to Julia, my voice steady but filled with the weight of everything I had been holding back. He's been playing you, Julia. He's been playing all of us. It wasn't just about being cool or fun. He's been trying to get under your skin, trying to break apart everything we've built. And all while you've been too busy worshipping him to see it. Julia's face was pale now, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of the situation started to sink in. She looked back at Kyle, her eyes narrowing. How could you lie to me like this? How could you think I wouldn't find out? You've been spending time with her behind my back, and you never thought it would come out? Kyle opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His confidence, which had been his weapon up until this point, was gone. He had nothing left to say, no excuses left to offer. He had been caught, and there was no way to turn back. I thought you were different, Julia whispered, her voice cracking. I thought you really cared about me. She turned to me, her eyes now full of hurt, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. Mark, I never knew. I had no idea. I thought he was just someone who could be a friend. The sadness in her voice stung more than anything else. This wasn't just about exposing Kyle's lies, it was about the hurt I saw in Julia's eyes. The realization that the man she had been enamored with wasn't who he appeared to be. For the first time since this entire ordeal had started, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself anymore. The truth was out. And no amount of Kyle's charm or manipulation could undo what had already been said. I turned to Kyle, looking him straight in the eye, my voice calm but firm. You've overstayed your welcome. It's time for you to leave. For a brief moment, he looked like he might protest, like he might try to spin some excuse or plea his case. But the fire in my gaze made him pause. His shoulders sagged, and he finally stood up, his posture defeated. I never meant for it to go like this, he muttered under his breath. But there was no remorse in his tone, only annoyance at being caught. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped back, giving him room to leave, my eyes never leaving his. He walked toward the door, and I knew this was the last time I would ever see him in my house. But I also knew this wouldn't be the last time I would have to deal with the fallout of his actions. As the door clicked shut behind him, I turned to Julia, who was standing in the center of the room, tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. I'm sorry, I said, my voice soft, my hand reaching out to her. I didn't want it to be like this. But I couldn't just sit back and watch him tear us apart. She looked at me, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a deep sense of relief. I didn't want to see it either, Mark. I was too blinded by everything he said, everything he made me believe. But you were right. You were always right. I pulled her into my arms, knowing this wouldn't be easy for either of us. There was still a lot to work through, a lot to repair. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we could start again. We could rebuild what had been broken, together. The door had barely clicked shut behind Kyle before the weight of what had just happened truly sank in. The chaotic energy in the room was palpable, but it wasn't just the sudden departure of a guest, no, it was the sense of betrayal hanging thick in the air. I glanced at Julia, who who stood frozen in the same spot where she'd been since the confrontation. Her face was pale, eyes wide, and her hands trembled ever so slightly, as if she were still trying to process what had just transpired. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. I took a step toward her, my heart heavy, unsure of the right words to say. How could I explain to her the years of frustration I had felt, the quiet suspicions that had gnawed at me, the way I had been watching as Kyle wormed his way into our lives and subtly undermined everything I had worked so hard to build with her? Julia, my voice was softer than I intended, almost a whisper, as if I feared raising it would shatter whatever fragile bond we had left after everything had unfolded. I didn't want this. I didn't want you to have to see this side of him. But I couldn't just let it go on. Her eyes flickered toward me, but she still didn't say anything. It was clear she was lost in her thoughts, struggling to make sense of everything. She had always been so trusting, so open, and I could see how this betrayal, from someone she had considered a friend, was tearing her apart inside. I know you didn't. But you were right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands now clenching at her sides. I should have listened to you earlier. I should have seen it. The words hung between us, heavy and laden with an unspoken truth. She had been blind to the warning signs, too caught up in the excitement of her cool new friend to recognize how Kyle had been manipulating her, and, by extension, both of us, since the moment he walked into our lives. I stepped closer, putting my hand gently on her arm, but she recoiled slightly, as if she was still unsure of where we stood. I understood. She was hurt, not just by Kyle's actions, but by her own blind trust in him. I never wanted to hurt you, I said, my voice steady but raw. But I couldn't stand by and watch him tear us apart. He wasn't just after you, Julia. He was after everything. My role in this family, our marriage, everything we've built together. Julia let out a long, shaky breath, rubbing her eyes as tears started to fall. I feel so stupid, she murmured, the words breaking through the wall she had built around herself. How did I not see it? How could I have been so blind? You're not stupid, I replied immediately, my voice firm but gentle. You wanted to believe the best in him. You wanted to trust him because he made you feel good, made you feel seen. But people like Kyle, people who live on charm and manipulation, they're good at making you see only what they want you to see. Her sobs were quiet, but I could feel the pain radiating from her. And as much as I wanted to hold her and make it all go away, I knew that this wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple gesture. The damage had been done, and now we had to deal with the aftermath. I led her to the couch, sitting down beside her as she let the tears fall freely, her shoulders shaking with the weight of everything she was processing. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of her breath catching in her throat. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that we would get through this, but I knew we couldn't gloss over what had happened. We had to face it head on. Do you want me to talk to Jessica? I asked softly, referring to my cousin, the one Kyle had tried to get close to when Julia wasn't around. I wasn't sure if it would help, but I needed to know if Julia wanted to clear the air with Jessica, or if it was something she wanted to leave in the past. She shook her head, wiping her eyes. No. I don't think it would change anything now. I feel like I've been living in some kind of fog, and now it's all come crashing down. I nodded, understanding more than she realized. I had spent so much time trying to keep things calm, trying to maintain the peace, that I had failed to notice how much the foundation beneath us was cracking. I should have said something sooner, should have confronted Kyle earlier, but I didn't want to destroy the image Julia had of him. I wanted to believe he was just some harmless guy who would eventually fade into the background. Instead, he had become a storm that tore through everything we had. I just want to make this right, Julia whispered, her voice breaking through the silence. I want to fix things, Mark. I don't want him to have one. I don't want him to have come between us. I reached out, pulling her into a gentle embrace, offering her whatever comfort I could. This was a crossroads, and we both knew it. The road ahead would be rocky. It wasn't just about getting rid of Kyle, it was about rebuilding trust, about rediscovering what we had lost along the way. "Julia, we're going to be okay," I said softly, even though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. But I had to believe it. We both had to. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Julia and I didn't talk much about Kyle, not at first. The weight of everything was too raw, too fresh. Instead, we focused on each other, spent time together in the quiet moments, letting the dust settle. I knew she was still processing everything, and I had to give her the space to do so. But as the days passed, the anger I had been holding on to started to subside, and what remained was a deep sadness, not just over Kyle's betrayal but over the fact that we had let someone like him into our lives in the first place. He had taken advantage of Julia's kindness, her openness, and it made me sick to my stomach thinking about how easily he had played us both. And then, one evening, as we sat together in the living room, just the two of us, Julia turned to me, her expression more somber than I had ever seen. "I don't think I want to be friends with him anymore, Mark," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I don't think I can be." My heart ached for her, for the disappointment in her voice, but I knew it was the right decision. "You don't have to, Julia," I said softly. "Sometimes, letting go of toxic people is the best thing you can do for yourself." Her lips trembled as she nodded, but I could see the clarity in her eyes. She was finally seeing Kyle for who he really was, not a friend, not someone worth keeping around. And that realization, while painful, was the first step toward healing. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page again. We had each other, and that was enough. But little did we know, this was just the beginning of the journey. Kyle's exit might have been swift, but the consequences of his actions would echo through our lives for a long time to come. The next few days were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. I could feel the tension between Julia and me, not in an overtly hostile way, but in a quiet, almost palpable distance that had grown between us. The house felt empty somehow, as if it had lost a certain warmth, an energy that had once felt like home. We'd had our fair share of disagreements over the years, but this was different. This wasn't just about a petty argument or a disagreement over household chores. This was something deeper, something far more profound. Kyle had come into our lives like a breath of fresh air, or at least that's how Julia had seen it. He was new, exciting, and in a way, he seemed like the type of friend I could never be. The type of guy who was everything I wasn't, carefree, spontaneous, and always in the moment. But now, as I looked at Julia, I realized how much damage he had done, not just to me, but to her, too. I knew she was hurting. I saw the way she stared off into the distance at times, as if reliving every moment she had spent with him, rethinking every word she had ever said to him. She felt foolish, betrayed by someone she thought she could trust. And I couldn't blame her for it. I had never seen Kyle for what he truly was, but Julia's attachment to him had blinded her, and in doing so, it had caused a fracture that wasn't going to heal overnight. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. It wasn't just about confronting Kyle, it was about confronting the reality that Julia had let him get close to her. It was about the damage done to the trust between us, and the slow and painful process of rebuilding that foundation. We had a lot to work through, but I was determined to fix what had been broken. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could do my best to ensure that this never happened again. I had to prove to Julia that I was her partner in every sense of the word. That I was there for her, no matter what. As the days passed, we found ourselves avoiding the topic of Kyle. It wasn't that we didn't want to talk about it, it was just that there was so much unsaid, so much pain and confusion hanging in the air, that neither of us knew where to begin. And so, we let the silence stretch on, like a wound that had yet to fully heal. But it wasn't just silence that troubled me, it was the underlying tension. Julia seemed more withdrawn than usual. She wasn't the same woman I had married, the one with the spark in her eyes, the one who could make me laugh even on my worst days. Now, there was something missing in her, something that I couldn't quite pinpoint. One evening, after we had finished dinner, I found her sitting in the living room, staring at the television, but her mind seemed to be 1,000 miles away. Her eyes were unfocused, her face pale and drawn, and I could tell she hadn't really absorbed a single thing on the screen. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. I wanted to ask her if she was okay, but I knew she wasn't. "Julia," I said softly, my voice tentative, careful. "We need to talk." Her eyes flickered toward me for a brief moment, but she didn't respond. She didn't even move. I sighed, leaning forward and taking her hand in mine. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. For both of us. But I can't help you if you don't let me in, Julia. We've been through too much to let something like this tear us apart." She finally looked at me, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of something, vulnerability. Her lips trembled slightly, and I could see the pain in her eyes. "I don't know where to go from here," she whispered. "I don't know how to trust again. You were right about him. I should have seen it. But I was so blinded by everything he said, everything he promised. And now I feel like I've lost something." I squeezed her hand gently, trying to offer some comfort. "You haven't lost anything, Julia. We haven't lost anything. He's the one who's lost, not us. And as for trust, that's something we'll rebuild together, okay?" She nodded slowly, but the sadness in her eyes didn't dissipate. I knew it wasn't going to be as simple as just saying the words. Trust had been shattered, and it was going to take time to repair it. I wasn't asking her to just forget about it, nor was I expecting her to instantly return to the woman I knew. "I don't want you to feel like this," I continued, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I don't want you to feel like you can't talk to me about anything, or that I'm not here for you. I am. And we're in this together, every step of the way." The tears she had been holding back started to fall, and I didn't know whether to feel relieved or heartbroken. It was the release I had been waiting for, but it also broke me to see her so vulnerable, so broken. "Mark, I love you," she said between sobs, the words coming out in a choked whisper. "I do. But I can't shake the feeling that I've let you down. I've let us down." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as if trying to erase all the pain she was feeling. "No, Julia. You haven't let me down. We've been through harder things than this. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this, I promise." It was a promise I couldn't make lightly. I knew the road to healing would be long and difficult. There would be days when we would both question if we had done the right thing, days when the memories of Kyle would resurface and remind us of the wounds that hadn't fully healed. But I knew that as long as we were willing to work through it, as long as we were both committed to rebuilding what had been broken, we could make it. For the next few weeks, we did our best to start fresh. Julia and I made an effort to reconnect, to focus on the things that made us happy. We took long walks together, talked late into the night, and found small ways to remind each other why we were partners in the first place. But as much as we tried to move forward, the shadow of Kyle still loomed over us. I could see it in Julia's eyes, whenever we were out, or when she would casually scroll through social media. The doubt still lingered. Kyle's influence was hard to shake, especially since Julia had once believed in his friendship so completely. And I could see that despite her best efforts to move on, part of her still felt a sense of guilt. One afternoon, Julia and I decided to visit my parents for a quiet weekend away. I hoped the change of scenery might help us both clear our heads, and I also thought it would be good for her to see a more familiar, supportive environment. It was during that weekend that we had a breakthrough. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset in silence, when Julia finally spoke up. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for not seeing what Kyle was doing," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I do know one thing, I can forgive us. And I know we can rebuild this. We just have to be patient, with ourselves and with each other." And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. We would never forget what had happened, but we could learn from it, grow from it, and come out stronger on the other side. The peace that settled over us after that weekend was, to put it simply, a breath of fresh air. Julia and I had taken the time we needed to let our emotions settle, and it was clear that we both felt the shift in the air. There was a quiet understanding now, an unspoken pact that we could still move forward together. But beneath the calm, there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't shake. We'd confronted Kyle, but his influence wasn't something you could just erase from your life overnight. I could see the way Julia sometimes still winced when I mentioned his name, or how she would hesitate before making plans to see friends, as though wondering if Kyle might pop up, just like he had at the most inconvenient times. The truth was, the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about Kyle. It was about everything he represented, the doubt, the intrusion, the feeling that our relationship wasn't safe from outside forces. He wasn't just a mistake in our lives. He was a symptom of a larger problem, a problem I hadn't even known existed until he'd made himself known. And that problem was trust. It wasn't just Julia's trust in him that had been shattered. It was our trust in each other. How had I allowed someone like Kyle into our lives in the first place? How had I let him get that close to Julia, knowing how manipulative he was? I hadn't wanted to admit it before, but the truth was, I had been neglecting certain aspects of our relationship. I had been too focused on maintaining the peace, too eager to keep everything calm, that I'd overlooked the quiet signals. And now, Kyle had turned everything upside down. One evening, after dinner, Julia and I found ourselves in the same place we had been so many times before, on the couch, with no distractions but each other. But this time, it was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, the weight of the unspoken thoughts between us pushing us both to finally confront the reality of where we stood. "Mark," Julia said softly, her voice almost hesitant. She seemed as if she was testing the waters, unsure of how to proceed. "I've been thinking. About us. About everything." I turned to face her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Jules?" She paused for a moment, her eyes searching mine, and for a brief second, I saw the vulnerability that had been hiding behind her walls. "I think we both need to start being more honest with each other. Not just about the big things, but about the small things too. It's like we've both been holding something back and it's starting to eat at me." I could feel the truth in her words, and I knew exactly what she meant. We hadn't been as open with each other as we needed to be. We had allowed the small issues to pile up, letting them fester instead of addressing them head-on. And now, it felt like everything was coming to a head. "You're right," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been afraid of pushing you too hard, afraid of making things worse. But in doing that, I've let things slide. And I should have spoken up sooner. I should have paid attention to the little things, the way Kyle made me uncomfortable, the way he was too close to you sometimes. I should have trusted my gut." Her eyes softened, and she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "It's not just you, Mark. It's both of us. I should have listened to you when you first started getting suspicious. I should have been more aware of how much I was letting Kyle into our lives. I got carried away, and I didn't see the damage it was causing." The honesty between us felt like a small victory. We had both acknowledged our faults, and more importantly, we had agreed that the only way forward was to confront them. But even as I appreciated the moment of clarity, I couldn't ignore the fact that Kyle wasn't gone for good. I had seen him leave, but I knew he wouldn't disappear quietly. The phone call came a few days later, and the moment I saw the name on the screen, I knew who it was. "Julia, it's him," I said, my voice tight as I handed her the phone. She looked at me, her face drawn with worry, and then she took the phone, her fingers hesitating for a second before answering. "Kyle," she said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it before. I could hear his voice on the other end, but I couldn't make out the words. He was probably trying to smooth things over, trying to pull her back into his web. "I thought we were done with him," I said softly, mostly to myself, but Julia heard me. We are, she said, her voice more firm now, but there was a flicker of something else behind her eyes. The vulnerability from earlier hadn't fully dissipated. There was still something unresolved, something Kyle had left in his wake. She put the phone on speaker, her voice cool but firm. What do you want, Kyle? There was a brief pause, and then his voice came through, smooth as ever. Julia, I know things ended badly between us, and I'm sorry for how everything went down. But you and I both know this isn't the end. You and I, well, we have something special. I can't just walk away from that. I could see the muscles in Julia's jaw tense, and I felt a surge of anger well up inside me. He was trying to worm his way back into her life, just like I knew he would. But this time, it wasn't going to work. Stop, Julia interrupted, her voice sharper now. You don't get to do this. You don't get to manipulate me anymore. You've caused enough damage, Kyle. Don't ever contact me again. Her words hung in the air for a long moment, and I could feel the relief wash over her as she pressed the end call button. I had been worried that she might falter, that some part of her would still want to hear him out, but she hadn't. She had stood firm. I'm done with him, she said quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. I don't need that toxicity in my life anymore. I nodded, knowing that this moment, though small, was a significant step in reclaiming what had been lost. But I also knew it wasn't the end. Kyle wasn't just going to walk away that easily. He was the type of person who never truly accepted defeat. The truth was, I was prepared for the storm to return. It might not happen immediately, but I knew that there would be another round. And when that time came, Julia and I would face it together. We had already weathered the first part of this storm, and we could handle whatever came next. But there was something else I realized in that moment. No matter how many obstacles Kyle threw our way, no matter how many attempts he made to re-enter our lives, we had something he couldn't take from us: his trust. It was fragile, it was new, and it was something we would protect at all costs. We might have been shaken by his actions, but in the end, we were stronger for it. The bond between us, though tested, had only deepened. And now, with each passing day, we were learning what it truly meant to rebuild and to fight for what was ours. The weeks that followed Kyle's final attempt to re-enter our lives felt like a delicate balance, one foot in the past and the other inching forward into the future. Julia and I were navigating a new kind of relationship now, one built on the wreckage of what had happened and the hope of a better tomorrow. But every day felt like a test. Could we truly rebuild? Could we truly move forward after the damage that had been done? At first, things seemed to fall into place slowly. We had our moments of laughter again, and those long walks we'd used to take now had a new significance. We spent more time together in a quiet, unspoken understanding of how fragile the world around us could be. Trust, once cracked and splintered, was now something we treated with utmost care, like a fragile piece of glass that could shatter if handled recklessly. But the work didn't stop there. It wasn't just about going through the motions of repairing our relationship. It was about digging deeper, confronting the underlying fears that had been gnawing at both of us during this entire ordeal. For Julia, there was still a lingering guilt, one she couldn't quite shake, that she had been manipulated by Kyle. She blamed herself for allowing him to enter our lives and believing his lies. I could see it in the way she sometimes pulled away when I tried to reassure her, the way she seemed to doubt her own judgment. For me, it wasn't about trusting Julia, it was about trusting myself. How could I have let someone like Kyle get that close? How could I have ignored all the red flags? I had been too focused on being the good husband, the one who didn't rock the boat, and in doing so, I had allowed someone toxic to sneak in and threaten everything we had worked for. And so, for both of us, the true work began, not just in the moments we shared, but in the silent battles we fought within ourselves. I knew that if we were going to survive this, we had to heal, not just together but individually as well. We started to carve out moments for honest conversations. No more avoiding the tough topics. I knew Julia needed to hear that she wasn't to blame, and I needed to hear that it wasn't too late for us to rebuild what had been broken. We were both learning how to communicate our fears, how to ask for the things we needed without guilt or shame. One afternoon, about a month after Kyle's final phone call, Julia and I sat together in the kitchen, the sunlight filtering in through the windows. The soft clinking of dishes as I rinsed them was the only sound in the room. And yet, there was a strange quiet comfort in that. "I don't know if I've ever really thanked you," Julia said, her voice quiet as she picked at the edge of her napkin. "For staying. For not giving up." I froze for a moment, surprised by her words. "There's nothing to thank me for. You're my wife, Julia. I made a vow to you, and I meant it. It's not always going to be easy, but that doesn't mean I'll walk away when things get tough." She smiled faintly, her eyes full of gratitude, but there was still a layer of sadness beneath the surface. She wasn't done healing yet, but I could see the slow, steady progress. I had to believe we could both get there, together. "And I know it hasn't been easy for you either," she added, her voice laced with the kind of understanding only someone who has truly shared in your struggles could have. "I've hurt you, too. By not seeing what was happening. By letting Kyle manipulate me and putting us both in a position where, well, you had to fight for us." I reached over, taking her hand gently in mine. "You don't have to apologize for that, Julia. We were both blindsided by him. But what matters is that we're here now. We're working through this. And we'll get through it." The weight of those words felt heavy, but it was a weight I was willing to carry. Julia and I had started down the path of healing, and I wasn't going to let anything stop us from walking it together. There were moments of doubt, small whispers in my mind, asking if things would ever truly be the same again. But with each passing day, I found myself becoming more and more certain that we could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and we would have to work hard to regain everything we had lost, but I knew we had something worth fighting for. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the conversation that had to happen. I knew Julia had to let go of Kyle completely. She had to cut all ties, put him behind her once and for all. The specter of his influence had hovered over us long enough. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch again, her eyes cast out into the horizon. She was deep in thought, and when I approached her, she didn't immediately look up. "Are you thinking about him?" I asked, my voice soft, but there was a seriousness behind it. I needed to know where her mind was. She didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she turned to me. "No. I was thinking about us. About how we move forward. About what I have to do to make sure that he is really gone, for good." I felt a small weight lift off my shoulders. "Julia, do you think we're ready for that? I mean, really ready? Because I don't want to rush you. I know this is all still very fresh." Her eyes locked with mine, and for the first time in a long while, I saw complete clarity there. "I think I've been ready for a while. It's time for me to let go of him. He doesn't deserve a place in our lives anymore, and I'm done letting him linger." I couldn't help but smile, a mixture of relief and pride flooding through me. "Then let's do it, Jules. No more doubts. No more looking back." The next day, Julia did it. She deleted Kyle's contact information, removed him from her social media, and sent a final message. She thanked him for his past friendship, but made it clear that he was no longer a part of her life. There were no more half measures. No more lingering ties. It was a moment of closure for both of us, but it didn't come without its own small heartbreaks. Julia wasn't just closing the door on Kyle, she was closing a chapter of her life. But it was a chapter that no longer served her, that no longer belonged in our story. We spent the rest of the evening in each other's company, the quiet joy of knowing we were finally free from his grip settling over us like a warm blanket. We had made it through the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. As I sat beside her, I knew one thing with certainty: this wasn't the end of our journey. It was just the beginning. We were stronger now, not because we had avoided the hard moments, but because we had faced them head on. Together. And in the end, I realized that trust wasn't something you just regained. It was something you built from the ground up, brick by brick, and that's exactly what we were doing. One small step at a time.